The entire decade of the 1850s uh, was the coming of the Civil War. And what happened is there was a growing polarization between North and South. They were getting further and further apart, like the North Pole and the South Pole, therefore the term polarization. And you will see that in many different events of the 1850s. Now, the first major event of the decade was the Compromise of 1850. It was urgent because of the end of the Mexican-American War and the Mexican Cession. Spelled this way, cession means giving up land. Mexico gave up a huge amount of land to the United States, the whole southwestern United States, including California. Uh, the South was anxious that this area be made available for slavery. And they were worried that if it didn't, that they would lose their ability to control the politics of the nation, which they had done for most of American history up until that point. They were very aware that the population of the North was growing rapidly, much more rapidly than the Southern population was growing. And therefore, they were concerned that they would lose the ability to protect their institution of slavery. The Compromise of 1850 had several provisions, several features. First of all, California was admitted as a free state. Uh, in the New Mexico and Utah territories, which are a huge area, uh, the decision was that at some point in the future there would be popular sovereignty, that the people of those areas would vote on whether they would allow slavery or not. Uh, they agreed that there would be slavery but no slave trade in the District of Columbia. And finally, the two sides agreed on a very strong new Fugitive Slave Act. This was the most divisive feature of the Compromise of 1850. This would not have happened had it not been for the death of President Zachary Taylor. He was elected in 1848 uh, and died rather suddenly after being ill for only a few days in July of 1850. He was opposed to the compromise, but Millard Fillmore, who his vice president, who became president there, was for it. Now, without the compromise, would the Civil War have been fought 10 years earlier? Many historians think so. And if so, who would have won? Many historians think perhaps the South, because during that decade of the 1850s, the North made tremendous gains in industrialization, in railroad construction, and in population, largely as a result of immigration. Now, if we look at a map of the Compromise of 1850, these areas here, the New Mexico and Utah territories, were left open to popular sovereignty. California was admitted to the Union as a free state, and the boundaries of Texas were established. Now we're going to look in a bit more detail at each of the provisions of the Compromise of 1850. California could have been split into a northern and a southern section. The South wanted to do this and to make the southern section open to slavery, but this was defeated, and California was admitted as a free state. Slavery had never been rooted there, had never been important, and the residents did not support it. So it didn't make sense to make California partially a slave state. Now this, however, gave the North an advantage of one state in the Senate. The South grudgingly accepted this because California had voted with the South on many issues. Now let's review the admissions of states to the Union. As of 1837, there were 26 states, 13 free, 13 slave. In 1845, Florida was admitted as a slave state, and the intention was that they would be paired with Iowa as a free state. This happened, but as we discussed earlier on another presentation, Texas was admitted as a slave state in 1845, which gave the South an edge of one. Now, in 1848, there was another free state, Wisconsin, admitted to the Union. That balanced it out, and with the admission of California, the North had now had an advantage of one state in the Senate, or two more senators from free states. Now, on the issues of New Mexico, Utah, and Texas, this was the resolution. The slave status of New Mexico and Utah would be determined in the future by popular sovereignty. Now, when it came to Texas, the original boundaries of Texas as defined by the Lone Star Republic, the Republic of Texas, extended into this large gray area here, as well as the boundaries of present-day Texas. But if you'll notice, this gray area was taken away from Texas, and the northern boundary of Texas lines up with the Missouri Compromise line, with the southern boundary of Missouri. Now, the northwestern part of Texas was given to the New Mexico territory here, and this land in the far north was simply added to the unorganized territory. The federal government gave Texas $10 million for the land, which allowed Texas to pay off its debt. Now let's review the major features of continental expansion through 1853. By 1853, the North, or the Union, had gained all the territory that it would have in the 48 states. Now you can study this map on the PDF and look at the various areas here and how they were added to the Union. Now, another provision of the Compromise of 1850 was that the slave trade was banned in Washington, D.C., even though slavery continued to exist there. This was a concession to the North. A lot of Northern members of Congress were very embarrassed by seeing slave trading auction sites within walking distance of the Capitol. They considered this a blot on the nation. Foreign dignitaries, foreign ambassadors would see it, and they wanted it out of D.C. But slavery, however, continued to exist in the nation's capital. Now, the most divisive provision of the Compromise of 1850 was the Fugitive Slave Act of that year. This was designed to entirely please the South. Bounty hunters just needed documentation from their home state, a southern state, that the person they captured was a runaway slave. And the descriptions that they brought were often very vague, which left the door wide open for mistaken identity. Now, if one was charged with being a runaway, that person was not given a jury trial and could not even testify in court in his or her own defense. This was something that Northerners considered outrageous, especially abolitionists. All law enforcement personnel in all of the states of the Union, including the North, were required to turn in suspected runaways. And even private citizens could be formed into posses as slave catchers against their will. And anyone aiding a runaway slave could be imprisoned for 6 months and fined $1,000, which is the equivalent of more than $20,000 in today's money. Even more outrageously, perhaps, federal commissioners, those who made the decision about whether a person would be returned to slavery in the South, were paid $10 for those they returned to slavery, but only $5 for those they declared free. The argument was that there was more paperwork involved for returning a person to slavery than for setting that person free. But the possibilities for abuse were absolutely enormous here. And as a result, under the law, 332 persons were sent to slavery in the South, and only 11 were declared free. Abolitionists were outraged, and the number of them grew dramatically after this. The Underground Railroad grew, and it grew longer also because now to reach safety you had to get all the way to Canada. Even if you got to Ohio, to Michigan, to Massachusetts, to Maine, you were not safe from being hunted down by bounty hunters and being rounded up, even with the help of local law enforcement personnel. Now you can see these video links on the PDF version of this, but not from this movie version that you're watching right now. Eric Foner, who's probably the most renowned historian of this period, argues that the law was an enormous expansion of federal power. Southern states, even to the present day, like to talk about how they stood for states' rights. Foner argues that they weren't interested at all in states' rights. They were interested in the right only to do one thing, and that was to keep slaves. They were interested in slavery, not in states' rights. Another huge event takes place in 1852, and that is one of the two biggest publishing events that affected American history. The first one was the publication of Thomas Paine's Common Sense in 1776, and this one was written by Harriet Beecher Stowe, called Uncle Tom's Cabin on the Evils of Slavery. And it added dramatically to the growing polarization between North and South. President Lincoln, about 10 years later, met Harriet Beecher Stowe, and when he was introduced to her, he said, "So you're the little lady who made the book that made this great war." Now, in 1852, there was a presidential election, but surprisingly enough, it was not split between North and South. Even though Franklin Pierce, the Democrat, was from New Hampshire, and Winfield Scott, the Whig, was from Virginia. But Pierce won dramatically, or very easily in this campaign, by arguing that the Compromise of 1850 had settled the slavery question once and for all. It hadn't. Pierce is routinely, for a number of reasons, rated as one of the worst presidents in American history. I think most historians would agree on that. One of the things that President Pierce agreed to was the KansasNebraska Act. Now, since 1820, this Missouri Compromise line had divided free territory in the north from slave territory in the south. But in 1854, that was wiped out, and Kansas and Nebraska were opened to popular sovereignty. That meant at some point that people would decide whether there would be slavery there or not. Now, it called for two things. As I said, popular sovereignty in Kansas and Nebraska. And in order to do this, they had to repeal the Missouri Compromise, because that had separated slave territory from free territory. And now that no longer applied. The law was the work largely of Stephen Douglas, a Democrat of Illinois, who had his own motivations. He wanted a transcontinental railroad along a northern route because it would benefit his home state of Illinois, his home city of Chicago, and it also had the potential to make him personally quite rich because of investments that he was interested in. Just the year before, Congress had approved the Gadsden Purchase, in which the United States bought land from Mexico that could have been used for a southern route for a transcontinental railroad. So Douglas had to overcome that to get his northern route for it. But in order to do that, he had to please the South. And the way he did that was to open Kansas and Nebraska to the possibility of slavery. Douglas was also fiercely ambitious to become President of the United States. And he felt, as it turns out wrongly, that if he did things to please both North and South, that he could walk a middle path and turn that into the presidency. He, of course, failed to do that. The consequences of this law were dramatic. It destroyed the Whig Party. Now you might wonder, well, Douglas is a Democrat, not a Whig. Why did it destroy the Whig Party first? Well, the Whig Party was the political home of anti-slavery people, including a good number of abolitionists. And they would have nothing to do with Southern Whigs, who, after this, because Southern Whigs had so strongly supported the Kansas and Nebraska Act, it was the difference between the conscience Whigs of the North and the cotton Whigs of the South. There was a little glitch in Windows. Just to finish this slide, the other major consequence of the Kansas-Nebraska Act was to provoke enormous outrage in the North. The North hated this. For the most part, the South loved it. And Douglas was only able to sneak it through Congress by convincing enough Northern Democrats to vote for it. Now, as a result of this, he thought it would settle the slavery issue in Kansas. Nothing could have been further from the truth. Anti-slavery settlers poured into Kansas. Pro-slavery settlers poured into Kansas. They had competing elections and an enormous amount of violence. For example, in March of 1855, the pro-slavery forces won an election, partly because a lot of voters poured in from Missouri, neighboring Missouri, and voted illegally. The following year, there was a free state governor and legislature elected in Topeka. So you had competing governments of Kansas. Now, in May of 1856, slavery supporters sacked, looted, trashed the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which was made up of free settlers, those who were against slavery, abolitionists mostly. And then a few days later, John Brown, who was an abolitionist, massacred 5 people, slavery supporters, at Potawatomi. This touched off what amounted to a guerrilla war in Kansas. To make matters even worse, in May of 1856, a senator, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, an abolitionist, was beaten viciously by a supporter of slavery from the South, Preston Brooks, and this further worsened the gulf between North and South.